You know the story, right? As our cities get bigger and bigger, nature gets pushed further and further out. But what if the data tells a completely different, and honestly, a much greener story? Let's dig in. I mean, it's the classic image we all have in our heads, isn't it? The concrete jungle. The logic just feels undeniable. As cities grow, nature has to go. It feels like this inevitable, kind of sad trade-off we just have to accept.
And to be fair, the first part of that story is absolutely true. We are living deep in the urban century. For the first time in human history, more than half of us live in a city, and that number is just climbing and climbing fast.
And that means more buildings, more roads, more concrete. You can see it happening all over the world. It really does feel like this relentless march of gray structures replacing green landscapes.
So, the logical conclusion seems obvious. More city has to mean less green. It's a simple equation that we almost never stop to question. But what if our common sense is wrong?
Well, instead of just relying on these old assumptions, a global team of researchers decided to actually measure what's been happening. They used almost 2 decades of incredibly high-resolution satellite data to get a really clear picture.
And the scale here is just wow. This wasn't a study of just a few places. We're talking about an analysis of over 1,000 of the world's major cities. This gives us a truly global picture for the very first time.
So, what did all that data actually show? Well, this is where that whole conventional story about concrete jungles really starts to fall apart.
Okay, first, we got to get a key definition down. The study didn't just count up the total number of parks and trees. It measured something called green space exposure, which is basically how much green an average person actually experiences in their day-to-day life. It's a much more human-centered way of looking at nature in our cities. And here it is, the first major shocker. Between the years 2000 and 2018, across all those 1,000-plus cities combined, the total amount of physical green space actually went up. Human exposure to that green space also went up. And maybe the most surprising thing of all, the inequality, the gap between the greenest and least green neighborhoods, that actually went down.
But, a global average can hide a lot of the interesting stuff. So the researchers dug deeper. And what they found is that this positive trend is really a tale of two very, very different urban worlds.
This table really shows the stark divide. In the global north, so cities in places like Europe and North America, the story is pretty simple. Physical green space increased and people's exposure to it went up even more. But now look at the global south. These cities actually lost physical green space overall. And yet, somehow, human exposure still managed to go up a tiny bit, while inequality and access just plummeted. How is that even possible? So, the crucial point to get is this. You have one group of cities that are actively adding parks and trees, while another group is losing them to rapid expansion. Two completely opposite trends when it comes to the actual supply of nature. And this brings us to the most fascinating puzzle in this whole study. If the supply of green space was actually shrinking in the global south, how on earth did access to it become more equal for everybody?
To understand this, we need to quickly talk about how they measured inequality. They used something called the Gini index. All you really need to remember is this. A score of 0 means perfect equality, and a score of 1 means perfect inequality. So a lower score is better. A decrease is a good thing.
And just look at this comparison. Inequality and access to green space fell everywhere, which is great news. But in the global south, it fell almost 4 times faster than in the global north. This is the heart of the paradox. How did the places that were losing green space manage to share it out so much more equitably?
This is the question that just unlocks the entire story. It sounds completely impossible, but the data is crystal clear. So, what's the mechanism behind this totally counterintuitive trend? The answer turns out isn't just about how much green space there was, but everything to do with where it was added, or where it was lost. Let's break down the 2 pathways the study found. It turns out the spatial pattern of this change is literally everything. It's all about the geography of greening and degreening within the cities themselves.
The study found 2 key ways to get to more equality. The first is what they call the additive path, which was common in the global north. That's where cities intentionally add new parks and green spaces and often put them in areas that were underserved. Makes sense. But the second path, the subtractive path, is what explains the paradox in the global south. This is where a rapid development causes a loss of green space, but that loss often happens in the wealthiest, most foliage-rich parts of the city. So even as the city as a whole loses some green, the gap between the rich and poor actually shrinks.
So what do we do with all this information? What are the big takeaways for building better cities in the decades to come?
Well, the biggest lesson here is that the greenness of our cities is not an accident. Whether it's the intentional greening we see in the global north or the sort of unintended equity effects in the global south, these outcomes are driven by planning, by policy, and by our development choices.
What's really cool is that this study gives city planners a powerful new tool. They can now use this kind of data to create a balance sheet for their green space, tracking not just the total amount, but who has access to it. This can help make sure that future development is both green and fair. And that's really the final optimistic conclusion from the researchers themselves. They said that despite all the challenges, the first couple decades of this urban century have actually been a story of progress towards greener, more equal cities.
So the data paints a surprisingly hopeful picture, but it also leaves us with a really critical question. We now know that progress is possible. We even understand the ways it can happen. So the choice is really ours. How are we going to design the cities of tomorrow to be not just green, but green for absolutely everyone?